You know what? I think I wasn't gonna do this, but I think I will. I'm gonna go ahead and act like these are these are overlapping grasses, and so they have families of. And when I blend this, some of this is going to be left behind. And so if I start to make this seem like this is shapes overlapping other shapes, we're going to be in a little better. It's going to look better for the drawing, as I say. We're going to be in better shape, but that's not going to help for the drawing. But we're just going to continue to try to put in so the fact that, you know, this grass is a little bit in front of this grass, and so forth and so on. And I'm going to start looking at I'm looking at the shapes while I'm making them. I'm looking at the reference. I'm looking back at the drawing that we're doing. Sometimes charcoal will make a little squeaking sound when we use it. That's just a part of working with it. Sometimes you can change the angle of the mark, and it won't do that. Other times, you know, you can't do anything to stop it. But that's just a parcel of the medium. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing. And again, this is all in shadow, so I'm gonna really try to work and get some different contrasts. And again, even though it's in shadow, we should be seeing a little more detail here than, especially along the edge, than what we see back there. And that means sharper edges, brighter contrast, that sort of thing. I'm going to come in here, I think, with a little bit of this as well to give us some of the darks. And then we're going to go ahead and use, again, tissue. I use tissue a lot with charcoal drawings. And we're going to take this, and again, we're going to just blend out as we come into shadow. Again, we're going to try to, now I can't see that as well, so maybe I'll use this on the edge because I want a little more control. So this little stump will give me just a little bit more control as I start to blend some of this out. Okay. So So again, we're just trying to blend this out a little bit. So now again, it's a little splotchy in there, a little chaotic. And so we're going to try to introduce more and more value into it so we can get a little bit more uniformity. We do want some variation because, again, there's supposed to be some grasses in there and all that good stuff. But too much, again, it won't read like anything. It'll just become a mess. And so, again, when we're dealing with this, we want to have a balance. We want, you know, a little bit of, because there's light to dark patches. There are patches that are sharper edged. There's patches that are softer edged. And we want some of that subtlety. Right now, we're just trying to get, again, a little bit more of a little more even tone in here. We also want a little bit of a darker tone in some places. Again, because this is in shadow. Now I'm darkening the tops because this will be darker. That will make this come forward. Again, we're trying to look for the groupings. What's going to show that there's one group in front or in back of another. and it's going to be a change of value. It's very similar to what we're doing up here. Okay, so we want some of this happening on some of our grasses through here as well, as far as that goes. Now we haven't even gotten really to the, this is all basically backdrop for our center of interest, which is out here. So doesn't mean it's unimportant, it's actually very important, but we're going to get into that very soon. Again, I'm squinting my eye, I'm looking for the shapes that are changing. Again, these darker shapes are a little jagged to show that it's, you know, behind the tops of grass. So again, I'm looking for some of these irregular or jagged grass-like shapes, long bladed shapes, some where the blades come together and they start to make sort of a crown, like what we're doing right here looks a little bit like a crown. So we're going to start to look for shapes. It's all about shapes when we draw. What does the shape look like? Is it, and what we'll do is you'll use your look for alphanumeric shapes. Does it look like a certain letter? Does it look like a, like, you know, does this, you know, look a little bit like a bunch of M's thrown together, or a bunch of V's, or, you know, what have you? Or you can look for more complex shapes. It's like, well, a crown, and everyone usually sort of knows what a crown looks like, and so, you know, you go, well, that looks like a crown. Well, then make a crown out of it. So, you know, we're going to start to get these shapes in here. I'm going to go ahead and start to blend this out a little bit, because again, we don't want too much. If it gets too much detail because it's in shadow, it should be blowing some of it out. You're going to see most of the detail along the ridge line, along the edge. So we want to be careful that we don't have too much detail in deep shadow. It's going to really be along this area that we're going to see the most of it. You know, the spaces between the grasses and things like that we'll read as detail. So, and we're going to keep, you know, working on this. This is what's going to help us to, you know, again, as we look at the photograph. And for those in my class, you're going to get the reference. You'll be able to check the reference. Again, I'm constantly taking my eyes out of focus, constantly looking at the reference, looking back at my drawing, then looking back at the reference and looking back at my drawing. And I'm just looking with my eyes out of focus to look for the basic shapes, to look for the basic relationships. It's all about, you know, relationships. That's what we want. Okay. So I'm going to keep it up, just trying to get some more. So we're actually going to come back here and we're going to start to lay in some of the trees over here. We're going to deal with some of the meadow through here. So we'll be back. So we're going to go ahead and continue. We have an area of a tree line right along here. Now we've got also the fact we got this, you know, this is in shadow, this is this bright light, this meadow, and then we've got this tree line. And we haven't really, you know, done anything with that tree line yet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this and we're going to go ahead and start to put some value in there. I might use this pencil right here. Now, if I look at this, this is slightly, you know, a little darker than these trees, because things are lowering their, you know, they're getting a little lighter as they go back. This gets lighter as it goes back, and that's happening with the trees too. So this value right here that we're starting with, we want to be slightly, you know, slightly darker than that. That's the lights. The shadows will then be darker still. So that's how this will start to look like. That's what will give it the sense of form and everything as we... Now again, I didn't... This is, like I said before, this is a caricature. And so, like these trees, we're trying to vary, you know, the exact tree line. Unless someone has the picture right there to compare with it, they're not going to know if you varied it a little bit. And so that's what we're doing. We're trying to vary the trees a little bit, just so that they had an interesting shape. So if you have a shape where it's all, let's say, this, 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 that's very repetitive. It's, you know, when you have just the same shape, you know, can repeat it over and over and over again. So what we could do to make that more interesting instead is you can do small to big. So you could do something like this, right? Now this is a little more interesting and there's a little bit more going on, but you could even vary it more to make it more interesting. So maybe this is a big one, and then we hit a medium one, and then we have a smaller one, and then we have one that's just a little bit bigger but not as tall as that one, and then another one that's, you know, not, you know, again, not, you know, but a little taller than that but not as tall as this, and then that goes into, you know, one where this, it comes like this, and, you know, now we've got something where, again, it's a little bit more varied, a little more random. Now you could also make it so the shapes aren't the same every time, because this is, even though this is a little more active, or people might call this more interesting or more active, we could vary it so it's not all the same little bump. And so as we look at these trees, we're going to have, basically these trees are little triangles, right? It's just that some of these trees, you'll have one tree there and another tree will overlap that, and then we'll have another tree where it comes down and overlaps that, and then this comes up and that goes there, and this, so again, and then you'll have some variation where this, you know, the crown of the tree, or not the crown, but the branches vary a little bit, and it just is going to make it a much more interesting shape. So that's what we're going to do with this area, is try to get this to look like trees. And not just trees, but interesting shapes. And I didn't care that they were close to what's there, but they're not exact, because we're not doing, this isn't a portraiture of a portrait of those trees. This again is a caricature. We want it to look close enough where people, you know, if you showed them this and then showed them that separately, they'd be like, yeah, that's the same scene. But then if you gave them the photograph, they'd start to see, oh, well, wait a minute, and you compared, well, then there's going to be some nuances and things like that that are different. And sometimes artists are doing, because either they're like, look, I'm going to change things to make it look better. And artists do that all the time. Like, if I do this and change this and I change that, it makes the drawing, it makes the image better. If I don't do that, the drawing will be worse. So we want to make sure, as we are now, before I get it, I was going to blend this. Before I go any more, though, I got to get back, because I've kind of lost some of the shape in here, as far as that goes. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to darken the shadow sides, again, to try to get some form built back up into here. And these shadows are going to be darker than these shadows up here because getting more contrast. They're closer, there's going to be more contrast. So I'm looking for some of the shapes that we have of these, you know, these different little, there's small trees and shrubby trees and bushes and all this sort of shrubbery and all this stuff kind of going on in here that's giving and helping create the illusion of trees and overlapping stuff. And we want some of that in there. We don't want to forget that. We don't want to ignore it. It's going to help the illusion, as people like to say, the illusion of this tree line. And so we want some of that. Why wouldn't we? So this is, again, we're getting some cast shadow across some of this through here. So we've got the cast, this shadow casting across here. And we're going to continue to move, and I'm going to try to, I don't want to ignore this. This is pretty important stuff. And it's just shapes. Right now we have two values, and if I do the values right, it's going to look like it's light and shadow. A great exercise that a lot of plein air artists do, which plein air painting is painting the landscape outside. And it's not just something the painters do. Drawing people do it all the time. I'm doing it right now. But it's to help you start to see just the basic shapes of things. And so you'd break everything down into two separate values, just light versus dark, light versus shadow. And what they would have you do when you were taking a workshop, to really force you into simplifying everything, they would give you a 1-inch Sharpie marker, square Sharpie. And obviously when you have a square Sharpie like that, you can't do minute little details. It ain't going to happen. And so what it forces you to do is it forces you to try to start, to find those shapes. It forces you to break everything down into these different little shapes of shadow versus light. And once you do, it really changes the way that you view value and the way that you view objects and what really defines an object. It's really quite eye-opening. There's no other way to put it. I mean, it's extraordinary. And that's what we're doing here. We're trying to bring in some of this idea of this is in light and this is in shadow. This is in light. As it's in light, there's going to be a little bit of shadow that defines the light. The light defines the shadow, defines the light, and the light, breaks free of the shadow, and they have a relationship. The light will start to attach to places, like this opens up into there, this opens up into there. So you have the light and dark, so there's this whole idea of people use a nice term called natan from Japanese ideas of design. And as I understand it, because again I'm not Japanese and I don't speak Japanese, but as it's been used in the Western tradition, they say that natan or notan or anyways, there's a different. I've heard people say it a little differently. I can't. Notan. I've heard people say notan as well. Say it a little differently, or is that it it references a balance of light and dark, like the yin and yang symbol. That's a balance of light to dark. And that the light and the dark both have a place. They both have a voice. And there's a certain amount of voice you give to the darks and a certain amount of voice you give to the lights. And there should be a balance. So it's really just it's an idea of composition, a way of composing things, a way of thinking about composition, a way of making decisions about where to place things based on a particular philosophy. Just like some people will talk about the Western traditions and talk about symmetry and dynamic symmetry and these different things when it comes to composition. And and I don't know how I got off on that, but it's again, essentially you're thinking of light to dark. And so it's very interesting. Now, some people will teach Notan or Notan or however you want to say it. Again, where you're breaking up the lights and the darks, or the light and the shadow, and things like that, and talk about it in terms of Japanese prints, and which was used, were seen by the early French impressionists, and they say they were, they tried to interpret and use some of these concepts of asymmetry, compositions, and things like that, and incorporate it into what they were doing. Monet and, Cézanne and others, Van Gogh and all that good stuff. They were heavily influenced by these Japanese prints that were coming in, and were very inexpensive and were becoming all the rage and had quite an influence in the French Impressionist movement, because they were no longer dealing with symmetry; they were dealing with asymmetry as a compositional idea, and that was radical thinking to use asymmetry as a compositional device. Now, so I guess I kind of got a little sidetracked. I apologize. But again, that's what we're using. We're using this concept of breaking stuff down. And looking for the light to dark balance. That's what we're trying to do is look for the balance in this scene. And balance is very important in composition, and so it's important to us to get some sort of, again, we just have to be aware and look for the shapes, the light and dark shapes. They will define the object. There's just, I could go on and on, but that's basically all it is. It's nothing any simpler or more difficult than just look for the shapes. Be aware of the shapes. Find the shapes. I mean, that's it. Whenever we're drawing, it's always, when I tell people, hey, always look for the shape, look for the value, look for the shape, look for the value. And now we're simplifying. There's all these, there's 6 form shadows on every object, but when they group up like this, and they're this far away from us and they're distant, we don't see all 6 of those form shadows. We might see 3, or in this case, we might see 2. And so that's, but if we have a light side and a dark side, that's all we need. We're defining the object as having form. And so that's what I'm trying to do right now, is we're trying to define this object as having form over here. The pencil's squeaking a little bit. This is one of those Contes. The Contes keep a little bit more clean, linear shape, much more easily, much more readily. And so they're really great to use on things that are coming forward from background to foreground. Now that I've got this defined, I'm going to come back here and take a look in a couple places and see if there's, you know, some things that could give a little bit more depth to different areas, a little more value, perhaps. Like this tree right here still seems a little too light, at least if it's that value everywhere. But if we then start to go, well, it's got some halftones, and those halftones are over here. Again, well, it'll start to feel like it has, again, some nice light to dark. I'm grabbing this, this is a soft charcoal pencil to darken some of the darks over here a little bit. A little bit more. Now, this shape and that shape look very much the same. When that happens, that is not good, because again, we want some variation. So I'm going to go ahead and look at my shape again, because I could tell that they are not the same. And so then I decided to, again, vary this a little bit. As I look over here, you know, again, there's just a couple of things I can do to break it up so it's not the exact same as what's happening over here. As far as that goes. Now this is also a little bit darker as it's going off the page. A little less light there. There's a little bit more light over here. Now I'm not going to go nuts on this, but that dark and that light is going to be a high point of contrast. You know, again, that will really catch the eye, and it will really feel like that has the feeling of light, and it'll have some contrast, and it'll just be interesting. But this is a high contrast scene. We have shadow and really bright light, and so we're going to have some areas where we're going to have some very distinct light to dark situations. And I talked a little bit about that Natan or Notan, depending on who you ask. I think it's like potato and patata, or tomato and tomato, or something like that. But as this tree is getting lighter, the hillside behind him is going into shadow. Shadow's not as deep as these shadows, but again, so it's this whole thing about how does light and dark, light and shadow, how do they relate? When do they relate? You know, and so where this hilltop meets this tree line, this is a very important, the most important, I would argue, on this drawing for the light to dark relationships that we're looking for to give our subject a feeling of form, feeling of depth, and to feel like stuff. Oh, those are bushes. Oh, that's low-lying, you know, small, you know, or, well, actually they're not that small if they're that's a big tree, and this is, you know, a fourth or fifth of that. These are still pretty tall, but they're further away from us. So, you know, oh, that's this and this is that, and you know, they're going along a ridge line, and after this ridge line, you've got some of this. There's some brush down here. Again, this is very, 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 very light. So we want to be very, very careful, and we also want to make sure we don't destroy this feeling of contrast, because this is supposed to be the light is breaking through the clouds. It's just shining across this scene and lighting it up. I mean, they're really, you know, this is the part of the scene that we want to hold off on. But it's the most important. It's like when you're painting a fireworks scene, you really try to, you know, get the atmosphere of the night and the clouds, and you want to hold back on the color. You just till everything's right and the clouds are finally right and the night sky is right and the colors are all right, and then you put that little burst of color in there, and man, if you do it that way, it just lights it up. The thing just comes alive. And if you darken it too much, it's going to do the opposite. It'll kill it, as some people will say. Don't kill your, you know, your Devo, or you know, make sure that the main event really looks like the main event. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that this feels like this is really in light, and everything else is, you know, of course these are supposed to be lit too, but they're not, you know, they're going to have a little more contrast at the beginning than the hill. And then that contrast is actually getting gentler or less extreme as it moves further back into this this picture. And the more we can start to get this to have that relationship, the more interesting, the more exciting, the more visually, you know, the more we want to look at it. That's, you know, it's just going to be what the viewer's going to say. Oh wow, that looks cool. I remember I was hiking in the Tetons, in the Teton National Park, and I saw a scene just like that. And the clouds, you know, had lifted for just a moment, and the sun broke through, and it just lit up the field, and it was, you know, just so amazing. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give that, and it's all to create that illusion that everything has to work. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to get this thing to have that impact. That beautiful, wow, that holy smokes, is that the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life, or what? We're really, you know, looking to create that, and it's all about the basic things. It's all about light to dark. It's all about, you know, contrast. It's all about, you know, detail. It's all about, you know, how much do I see of this and how little do I see of that. There's all these little things that as they pile up, these little decisions that we're doing right now, that are going to really have that, they're going to make this really feel, you know, and create the illusion of a scene of trees with this cloudy sky that's being lit up as the sunlight breaks through the clouds and all this good stuff. Okay. So we're just going to continue to bring this in. Pardon me. Okay. Again, we're gonna take out some of this, or we're gonna soften it. So I'm gonna use a little stump. This will have a little bit more, be a lot easier to control than if I just took this and twisted it up. This again has a smaller tip, and it'll just be a lot easier. So for the finite work, that's usually where I'll start using more of these stumps as I'm working on a drawing. Okay. Now I want to make sure that the contrast is a little bit less as it goes back. So there's some areas here that I just think are just a little bit too dark. Like right there. But just a little too similar. Okay. Let's see if I can wipe away some of that. Now this is supposed to stay soft. This is supposed to be a little brighter. We're just barely getting this laid in here, but perhaps on the, we can see that it's just, we're really starting to get an illusion starting to happen. We're getting a glimpse of it. It's not quite there, but we're getting, a little bit starting to happen. Now I always tell people, work your plan. So a lot of times, and the good thing about drawing is that we all start in the same place. We all have to start at the beginning. And so, I was, back before I was a professional artist, again, I had to learn. I remember the first time I picked up a pencil. And in terms of really serious drawing, I didn't start really drawing serious until I was in high school. Other than that, it was something I liked, I enjoyed, and wished, this, that, or the other. But it wasn't until high school where I got into a class and I started to see that, that there was things called illustration, and there was a commercial art field, and there really were people that, worked in an industry, a creative industry like drawing, and weren't living out of their car or whatever, that you heard from other people, because they never had met anyone that was in the arts that was doing anything, and so that was when I got really excited, because I'd always wanted to draw. I'd always wanted to be in the arts and an artist and just be creative, and it was really again in high school that became a viable option. I was like, wow, this really, things like this exist, and it was pretty spectacular. So, but again, I came to it a little, on the later side. I'd been drawing ever since I could remember, but in terms of thinking that, this is something that I want to do, and this is something that I perhaps could do, it wasn't until high school where I got into a serious art class, and we were started to talk about structure and value, and these different types of things, and how things are put together, and perspective, and all this sort of stuff that is very, very much the fundamentals of drawing and painting. And but once I got into it, man, I latched on, and I ran with it. And so I'm just saying that everyone does start at the beginning. Everyone has to, and so everyone makes the same mistakes. And so that's why people come and take classes from a seasoned person or veteran, I guess, whatever. That supposedly I'm one of those, but I certainly have been around worked in the industry. I do know some stuff, you know, and so I certainly have things to share. I certainly have things to give, you know, to those who want to learn. And so that's why, you know, when people are making mistakes, I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember when I was doing that, you know. And sometimes we have this misperception that from the arts, that art just kind of oozes from people naturally, and that, you know, people are just natural talents, and that it's not learned, it's just something you have, and it's absolute utter nonsense. It's a skill just like anything else. And it's funny because there's things that we don't think about that with other things. I mean, most people don't go, oh yeah, born football player. I mean, he might be able to run, you know, or maybe he could catch a ball, but, you know, usually not. Oh, born lacrosse player. He might have some skills, but again, you still have to develop that. If you're going to be a professional, you know, and you're gonna work in an industry like that, you better hustle, because there's a lot of fast people out there. There's a lot of people that can, you know, grab a stick and run with it. So you got to be more than just that. And so it's this idea that it takes training. No matter who you are, it takes training. Even people that are very gifted, it takes training. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes you'll have people that don't have as much innate skill or talent, but they have the drive. And drive will take you further than talent in many ways.